Kia ora and welcome to The Prosperity Project, a podcast where we are on a mission to empower you financially. I'm your host, Nadine Higgins. And if you are wondering who the heck I am to tell you anything about finances, well, I started out as a business journalist, and these days I'm a finance columnist, an investor, and a financial advisor and coach. But I am also still figuring it out. I do not claim to be the font of all knowledge, which is why I will be bringing in the experts and mining their big brains every week for all the things you and I need to know. Today's episode is for those who are soon to be or perhaps dream of becoming parents. Having a baby is life-altering in every respect, and your finances are no exception. But there are ways to navigate how much growing your family can turn your finances upside down. Stephanie Powell is the founder of Crayon, where she's on a mission to make it easier for parents to effectively manage the dollars and cents alongside the nappies and the sleepless nights. Welcome to the Prosperity Project, Steph.
Kia ora, Nadine. Thank you very much for having me.
I'm just wondering what your story is. What led you into this line of work? I presume there's some personal experience that has led this?
Absolutely. It's based on my own experience. So I started my career in finance. It's what I studied undergrad. I was an investment banker, did a detour through tech, and about almost 6 years ago now, I welcomed my first child. I really have no excuses for financial literacy, but I certainly found out the hard way that there are a lot of financial puzzles to solve as a new parent. And when you're pregnant and you're juggling work, it just wasn't a priority until much closer to my due date. And also afterwards, that I found out there are all these other things that I wish I had known or done differently. And I figured I'm probably not the only person in that boat.
Absolutely not. And certainly not the first person who's perfectly financially literate to still find that there's a minefield of things that you need to understand. So hopefully we'll get through a few of those today. I suppose from a personal perspective as well, you would have been a good earner. You would have always been used to earning your own income. And I personally found that prospect a little terrifying, that you sort of become financially dependent on someone else when that might never have been the case previously.
I found it deeply uncomfortable. I've had a job since I was 14, whether it was the paper run or a customer service rep or what have you. And so to your point, it was the first time in my adult life that I didn't have an income stream of my own that matched my life stage, and to be reliant on my husband. And that's not a reflection of him. He's a lovely, generous human. But just the idea of being reliant on somebody else was unsettling, I think. And talking to a lot of working women, that feeling is a bit of a shock as well.
Yeah, it's one of the many big shifts you go through when you have a child. I know you've done a little bit of research. Where do finances tend to rate in the long list of things that as a new parent you could be freaking out about?
So research, it was conducted by AMP, and they found that I think 71% of expecting parents are financially stressed. And this was research done a couple of years ago before the cost of living crisis and mortgage rates going up. So I think that number has probably only gone up in that time. But in terms of preparedness, often we might budget for pram and car seat, etc. But it's actually the second, third, fourth order effects that really are much bigger in magnitude than the obvious costs. And so, and just in my personal experience, juggling that workload and that pregnancy, the financial planning got kicked down the list a little bit, to be honest. But I really describe it for me as a moment of truth. The theory about personal finance, or you should be doing more about it. But that was really a moment that I kind of had to grow up in a way and take it much more seriously.
I guess the temptation is to assume that it's simple, right? You go, hey, government, I'm having a baby. Do I qualify for paid parental leave? How much will you give me? Here's when my baby's due. And the rest kind of just falls into place. What else do we need to actually plan for?
So one is even understanding that parental leave legislation or entitlements. So, there's a work test that you need to meet in order to qualify. So you need to have worked any of the 26 weeks in the 52 weeks before your due date or your placement date, if you're, say, adopting or going through surrogacy. You also need to meet a different work test to take time off from your employer. So you need to have been at your current employer for at least 6 months, working an average of at least 10 hours per week to be entitled to 6 months off work. And you need to have been there 12 months to be entitled to 12 months off work. You can actually be entitled to the payments, but not to the time off to receive those payments. So that's a bit of a quirk.
How?
Well, say you change jobs jobs.
Oh,
close
so you
to
have been employed, but not by that employer.
That's right. So you then have to apply for negotiated carers leave, and there are certain reasons for which they can decline that. So that's one. So just know the rules to make sure that if you are thinking about switching jobs, that you are going to qualify for the time off and the payments. Then there's also what your employer might offer. And that's something we've done a lot of work documenting is, we are seeing more and more employers offer above and beyond the statutory entitlements. But again, they will have their own T's and C's. So sometimes you'll need to have been there 6 months or 12 months, or, I've seen at the outside 24 months. And then, you might need to be on a certain type of contract. So you might need to be a permanent employee as opposed to a contractor. Some of them have what we call clawbacks or bonding. So if you don't return from parental leave, or you leave within, say, 6 months or 12 months after your return from parental leave, you might be on the hook for paying some of that additional paid parental leave back.
Oh, and you would really want to know that.
You would
you?
Absolutely want to know that. And then there's also what your partner is entitled to, both under the law and from their employer. And a fun fact, or not so fun fact, is that New Zealand is one of 3 developed countries to have no paid partners leave whatsoever. So a lot of
Three countries.
Yeah, 3 developed countries with no paid partners leave.
So you're entitled to 2 weeks, but it's
Unpaid.
at 0 pay. And 2 weeks is really not a long time when you've got a newborn baby.
That's right. And MIMBI found that the utilisation of unpaid parental leave for partners is 4%. And that's not surprising.
Because the last thing you want to do when you've just lost one income is to then have 2 weeks of unpaid for the other partner.
That's right. So it's just not feasible for many families. So one is get clear on your entitlements. It's also good to know that paid parental leave in New Zealand is capped. So the government will match your income, and this is your before tax income, dollar for dollar up into, right now it's $754.87 before tax, and that gets reviewed every July in line with average wage increase. But for a lot of people, that's below full-time minimum wage. So most folks are going to be taking a haircut on their current earnings, and that could be significantly less than what you currently earn.
So therefore, how else can you look at cutting it or planning for it to kind of bridge that gap? I mean, you're probably going to be living a little smaller. There's not going to be many dinners out or flash holidays when you've got a newborn baby, I presume. But still, there's the bills to pay, the mortgage to pay, the rent to pay, whatever.
That's right. And that's why we often see, unless partners or fathers get paid leave from work, they're taking annual leave or time in lieu, and they're cobbling that together to get a week or two. But usually one parent will remain in full-time work. In New Zealand, a report commissioned by MSD found that 70% of mums take less parental leave than they want to, and a big driver of that is financial. And I think it was about half ended up going back earlier than they had anticipated. So the reality is
heartbreaking.
It is that, and I always come from the view of I have no judgment about how much time you want to take off, whether that's 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months, or become a full-time parent permanently. But the reality is that preferences and what's happening in terms of choices are quite different in New Zealand.
Yeah, I'm with you. Whatever your choices are, all power to you, but you need to have the flexibility to be able to make that choice and not have it made for you. That's the heartbreaking bit.
That's right. And then on the way back in, parents are facing childcare costs for, unless you've got family help or some sort of other arrangement. Another not so fun fact is New Zealand has the least affordable childcare in the world. So 2 parents earning the average income with 2 kids in full-time daycare can expect to spend more than a third of their income on childcare costs.
Which is when people go, I'm between a rock and a hard place. I can't afford to go back to work, but I can't afford not to go back to work.
That's right. You think about rent or mortgage payments. Most families, or a lot of families now, will rely on 2 incomes to make their life run.
Are there any other ways to cut it? Can you maybe split your leave with your partner if you're the higher earner, so it makes sense for you to go back to work? Or is it still quite a heteronormative, patriarchal sort of setup where it's still geared towards a man and a woman staying home? So
you can transfer it. Under the law, there's the mechanism for what they call the primary carer to transfer some or all of their entitlement to their partner. So it's possible. But the rules of use are relatively restrictive. So primary carer is defined as the birth parent or the parent taking responsibility for a child under the age of 6. So that already sets the norm that it's, frankly, the birthing parent who's the primary carer. And then if you transfer it, it's a one-way, one-time transfer. It needs to, the day yours finishes, your partners would need to start, etc. So the rules of use are quite prescriptive. And as a result, in terms of transfer rates, I think it's at somewhere between 2 and 4%. So most of the time, it's the initial primary carer keeps it.
There's a couple of fishhooks I've discovered simply through recently taking paid parental leave and also being on track to take it again quite shortly. One of them is about tax. And this caught two of my friends completely unaware. You mentioned that the entitlement from the government is pre-tax. So what do you need to know? Most people just assume like my tax rate's my tax rate and the IRD takes care of the rest. What do you actually need to know?
That's right. Certainly if you've always been an employee in one job most of your life, you haven't had to worry too much about taxes. But when it comes to paid parental leave, when you apply for it, you nominate the tax rate. There's a field to fill out. And the IRD has this guidance on their website. And they do say if you're receiving more than one source of income, whether that's on parental leave or not, generally speaking, you should apply a secondary tax code to avoid a tax bill later. So it's not that you have to pay more tax because you're earning a second source, but it's just to make sure it's taxed at the marginal tax rate.
And so that might apply, say, if your employer pays you some salary, but also maybe if you take some leave when you go on parental leave?
That's right. So if you're getting two streams of income, whether that's, say, an employer, paid parental leave, keeping in touch hours, receiving annual leave, etc., then the IRD website states that you should apply a secondary tax code. And I think that's where some people get caught out, is they don't realise that they need to apply a secondary tax code, or perhaps they don't use the correct secondary tax code because you need to estimate all of your income. The paid parental leave can start after other paid leave has finished. So you can sequence it so that you're receiving only one source of income at one time.
That makes it sound much simpler. And I guess if you can have at least some dribs and drabs of income coming in for the longest possible period, I mean, that helps with your budgeting.
That's right, with cash flow management. So the only thing to be aware of is your paid parental leave will finish the earlier of when you return to work. So as soon as you go back, it stops, or your child turning 1 or the first anniversary that they've been in your care. So you just want to make sure if you're trying to get the full 26 weeks out of it, that you're mindful of those dates too.
It sort of sounds like you almost need a degree in paid parental leave to understand all the parameters of it.
I've been doing this for a while, and it's what we do day in, day out. And I still every so often discover new things about the legislation or the way it's applied. So it is complicated. It's a lot to expect someone to navigate well when, they've got so much else on their mind too.
So you could end up with a tax bill if you've picked the wrong tax code when you're getting payments from your employer, or you've taken annual leave. Are there any other tax fishhooks?
So Working for Families, it's a program that's administered by the IRD, and it's designed to help families with young children, or actually dependents under 18. The way Working for Families works is it's based on your annual household income before tax, and you can elect to get payments throughout the year, but it's at the end of the tax year, the government looks at what you and your partner, if you have one, what you actually earned versus what you told them that you were going to earn. And if it's different, so say you actually earned more than what you told the government you're going to earn, they will do a wash up. And so you might get a tax bill saying, well, actually, we paid you this entitlement through the year because you told us your household was going to earn, say, $100,000, but actually you've earned $120,000, and so we overpaid you, and so now you need to pay us back. Or there are 4 tax credits under that umbrella. There's one called an in-work tax credit that, as the name would suggest, requires you to be in work. Now, if you get made redundant, or you say you've lost your job in that time, then you weren't technically
entitled to it.
It's right. So even though you probably needed that money desperately at that time. And again, perhaps you haven't informed the IRD, so they've been paying you, and then they do the wash up and they realise that you weren't in work during that time, and therefore you might get a tax bill for that. So that's one that can be quite tricky. I saw a headline the other day. A woman it was in one of the major newspapers, and she owed $47,000 in Working for Families repayments, essentially, to the IRD. Now, that's an extreme case, but I think the fact that it relies on estimation does make it tricky for some households to manage.
Absolutely. The other thing I discovered, which I didn't discover until I returned to work and Christmas rolled round, and so I'd been back at work for 2 or 3 months, went to take an annual holiday, got plenty of annual leave, but it's not actually worth the same as my normal salary. Why is that?
We've had people write in and say, I got paid $6 an hour. What happened? That's much below minimum wage. So there's a quirk in the legislation. I guess I would call it a quirk. And it basically says any annual leave you become entitled to while on parental leave or in the 12 months after you return is paid at your average weekly earnings. So that's what you've actually earned from your employer over the 12 months right before you take annual leave.
So if you've been off for 12 months earning nothing, it's worth nothing the day you come back.
Yeah, that's right. Theoretically, it could be worth nothing. And you might also be accruing leave before you went on parental leave, but didn't become entitled to it until you were on parental leave. So the way annual leave works, and it's under review at the moment, but you accrue throughout the year and then once a year you become entitled to it. And it's generally the anniversary of when you join the company, although some organizations will have a company-wide date. But either way, it's one date a year. So you could be accruing, and let's say your entitlement date is the week after you've started parental leave. All that annual leave that you accrued in that 51 weeks that you were working, plus the week that you weren't working, would be paid at your average weekly earnings once you take it when you come back.
I guess the good news there is it is under review. The bad news is who knows when they'll finish that review and actually change the law.
It's been under review since 2020 and we're now sitting in 2025. So
maybe around 2030. Look, we're going to talk a little bit more about Crayon and the register that you have set up shortly. But we need to take a very quick break. We will be back with Stephanie Powell after this. Welcome back to the Prosperity Project. We're talking to Stephanie Powell from Crayon about parental leave. And one of the great things you've done with Crayon is to create this public register of all of the companies that you're aware of that are doing something above the statutory minimum. Why was it important to have something that people can find from a source that's not the HR department of said company?
So the New Zealand Parental Leave Register houses verified policies of over 300 employers across New Zealand that actually covers 1 in every 6 working Kiwis. So it's got pretty good coverage for a little register. The reason I created it is it's an awkward question to ask. In a job interview, a lot of people would hesitate to say, look, what's your parental leave policy, for fear that it will work against them in that process.
They'll say, oh, right, she wants to go off and have a baby. Maybe we won't hire her.
That's right. Even though
they can't legally do that, but that doesn't mean that that isn't what's going through some employers' heads, right?
That's right. And even in your current role, if family planning is on the horizon for you, but maybe say it's a year or 2 out, you might not be ready to flag to your manager or flag to work that you're thinking about having a child, because you don't want to get, again, you might be concerned that good projects won't come your way, or promotions, etc. And I think in general, employers are getting better at it, but it is a fear that I think many aspiring parents hold. And so we created the register so that you can come and get accurate information discreetly, and hopefully over time we're growing it. We started with 180 employers when we launched it 18 months ago. We're now at, I think, 310 and growing. So over time, the idea is hopefully every New Zealander will be able to come on and find their parental leave policy in time. And we have employers on there who offer above and beyond the statutory entitlements. But equally, we have employers on there who offer the statutory entitlements and are being transparent about it. Because at the end of the day, that information is really critical for you and your partner, if you have one, to plan out what that parental leave looks like, given the financial implications that we talked about. So we celebrate all the employers who are on there because they're choosing to make it easier for expecting and aspiring parents to manage their finances. And
what has been the response from companies you have approached? Are they happy to lay their cards on the table? Is it hard to get that information?
Starting anything up from at the beginnings, obviously, it takes a little bit of time to get that momentum going, but we try to be really good stewards and citizens with that information. We work collaboratively with employers on that, and over 80% of the policies on our register are volunteered from the employer directly to us. The remaining 20% are sourced from publicly verified sources. So a lot of them are collective agreements or OIAs. That's where the majority of those come from. So the response has been really supportive from employers. We try to also give back data to them that's really useful when they come around to evaluating their offerings too.
Because what is the rationale for an employer offering above the statutory minimum? Because obviously it's a cost, right? There's no two ways about that. So what's the business case, I guess, as it were, as to why they would do that.
So I think if you frame the cost as an investment, perhaps.
I like that much more.
An investment in attracting and retaining talent. So Seek, they did a laws of attraction report last year in terms of what candidates are looking for. Across all genders, they found that parental leave is a must-have for upwards of 30% of candidates, and then another, say, 40-odd% are delighted if a company has it. So it's growing for, across the board as an expectation or a way to at least attract really good talent. I know we're in a bit of a funny market at the moment, but even for the employees that you have that you value, it's a way to retain them and to show up in a moment that matters. As an employer, you actually don't have that many opportunities to really show up for someone. And this is one of them. Border did this really great survey of moments that matter in the employee life cycle. And having a child is the number one most challenging. It's the moment an employee feels the most vulnerable. It's a moment. It's a moment where extra support would have meant the most. The second moment that people feel the least supported, and the most least supported moment, if that's the way to put it, is when they leave the company or leave the organization, which is a pretty low bar. So in terms of what you can do to go above and beyond that really is an opportunity to grow loyalty with an employee and have them come back when they're ready and feeling excited. And it's a huge transition.
Yeah. So is it just the big companies that are doing it, the ones with deep pockets, or are smaller and growing businesses recognising that this is part of looking after people and attracting smart, good people?
Yeah, it's across the board. So certainly I would say larger employers were probably some of the first to roll out the enhanced policies, and certainly they're the ones who you read about in the paper. But we have organisations of all sizes on there, from folks with 4 employees all the way to tens of thousands. So I would say it's growing, and a lot of the smaller employers have probably been providing support on a more ad hoc basis, but now we're seeing some of that formalized, and we try to provide a lot of tools to employers to help them do that. So for example, you can go on our website and download a free costing tool to help an organization estimate how much rolling out an enhanced policy would be. And there are other resources on there. So over time, we are seeing employers across the spectrum start to offer more support.
Well, it's a really fascinating register and some cool tools. So if you want to check it out, it is gocrayon.com. I want to talk a little bit about the longer term financial impacts. And hey, look, no one has children thinking that it's going to be some sort of money spinner, right? We know it's a cost, but there are some things that people don't think about, like the impact on their retirement savings, particularly for women. We're going to live longer and we end up with less in our KiwiSaver. And part of that has got to be the time we take out of paid work to raise children. Is there anything we can do about that?
That's right. So in New Zealand, the average KiwiSaver balance for women is 25% lower than it is for men. And a reason of that is, one of the drivers is because we take more time out of paid work and therefore make fewer contributions.
And it's a small matter of the pay gap, which gets worse, right, once you become a parent.
Yes. So in terms of what you can do about it, first is check your employer's policy. So a third of employers on our register actually make KiwiSaver employer contributions for the entire year. So they're recognizing that this is an issue people are facing, and they do a make good contribution often when people come back to work. So check your employer's policy. The second thing you can do is, from the 1st of July last year, the government started making what we would call like employer matching contributions on government paid parental leave. So it used to be that when you applied for PPL, you could elect to have KiwiSaver deducted, but there was no added incentive. Now, if you put in the 3%, the government will add the 3%. It won't cover your whole gap, but it is at least something towards your contribution.
That's cool. That's a good initiative, right? It doesn't take you all the way there, but it's a start.
That's right. It's a start. And then the other thing you can do is think about your contribution rates before and after parental leave. And I recognize not everybody's in the position to do that, but perhaps, I've had parents that we've worked with will increase their contribution rate on their way back into work to try, even if it's just for a period of time, understanding that, again, it's not feasible for everyone, but if you're in a position to do that, sometimes it's about making a voluntary contribution from your family finances. If you think about it, if you've got a partner and one person is taking the bulk of the time off work, they're essentially the ones taking the hit to their KiwiSaver. And so sometimes we'll see couples, they'll actually have a discussion of like, let's make a contribution, even if it's to make sure you maximize the government matching that you can get every year from family finances.
Yeah, which we have to acknowledge is $521 and change that is from the government, is free. It's before you get to investment returns. And so if you can make at least that work by putting in the minimum contribution to get it, it makes sense too.
Yes, if you can. So, to your point, for every dollar you put in, the government puts in 50 cents up into the cap. So you need to put in $1,042, and they measure that from the 1st of July to the 30th of June every year. So depending on when you take your parental leave and how long you take it for, it might be that you will fall short of that amount and you can tip in a bit extra to make it. So there's some of the ways we see people trying to plug that gap. I know it's not perfect, but hopefully there's some actions or there's something in there that you can do.
Some good practical things you can do there. What about pay reviews? Because if you're out of the workforce for 12 months, potentially you're overlooked for that.
Yes.
And then your income doesn't keep pace with inflation or, move up the pay scale.
That's right. You might miss out on one while you're on parental leave and then you haven't been back at work for very long. So perhaps you'll miss out on the next one. And
they say, I haven't met your KPIs because there were no KPIs because you weren't here.
So that's one where you might want to front foot it before you go on parental leave. As part of our register, we do ask employers if they continue REM reviews while an employee is out. And I think it's upwards of 90% of those on the register do. But I think that's one you want to front foot with your manager before you go. So how will REM reviews work while I'm on parental leave, and get some clear expectations around that. Sometimes an employer will review it right before you go, or you'll just be included in the normal cycle while you're on leave. Or I've also seen it where the employer will do the review as soon as you come back from leave. But I think understanding, even raising it or asking the question, and how will it impact any short-term incentives that you will have? How will it impact any long-term incentives? So for example, I was at a tech company when I had my first child, and I had options that were vesting. And I asked, I think I was one of the first to ask, and they said, it continues to vest because you're still an employee. And that was very fortunate for me because the company I worked for was acquired after I had left, but I still got that vesting benefit. So again, understanding how will taking parental leave impact all those dimensions. And, perhaps you're going for a promotion or an exciting project. And you touched on the gender pay gap. There's research showing that particularly once you become a mother, you're perceived as being less committed and actually less capable. And there's quite a lot of research. It's been well documented around the world. And in fact, 80% of the gender pay gap can be attributed to motherhood, or what they call the motherhood penalty.
Which is really depressing. And I feel like, contrary to my own experience, I feel like becoming a mother lit a fire in my belly, and I'm more committed and more ambitious than I was before because I'm doing it not just for me, but for my family.
I'm also more efficient than I was before.
Yes, but just out of pure necessity.
Yeah, that's right. So, that's also something to be conscious of. And sometimes you can't counter all of it, but again, what can you do, right? That's what this conversation's about. It might be, Nadine's just had a baby. We don't want to give her that project because, it's a lot of pressure on her and we don't want to put her under that pressure. Or, gee, that role involves a lot of travel. I know she's got a young child, so we're not even going to offer her that role, right? And so it's not coming from actually a bad place. But who knows what your circumstances are, right? You might want to take on that big challenge, or you might have a partner who's happy to change their role to accommodate yours. So as the parent, you want to front foot that and say, look, I'm still really keen on those projects, or, how is it going to impact the role I'm going for, and have those conversations, because if you don't, there's a risk that someone will make that assumption for you.
Yeah, so you want to at least have the conversation so that you can have a say rather than it being decided on your behalf. There's so much more I could ask you about, but we are running out of time. I just want to ask you one more thing. If you work for a company that didn't have any kind of added paid parental leave entitlement, what could you say to your employer that would make the case, whether it's for you or future parents, for them to consider doing it differently?
So, and I recognise it's a tricky one to ask about. Not everybody feels like they're in a position to do that. So you might want to do it before you go on leave, but equally I've seen people do it after they've come back and trying to make it better for the next person. And it's just asking the question, what is our policy here? How do we support parents on the way back in? And, if enough people ask, then it becomes a thing, right, that the company needs to solve. Or it might be, look, I've looked at some of our peers and they're doing more in this space. What are we doing? I think asking those questions can be a good way to generate or spark that conversation.
Well, you're doing amazing work in this space for people who are going through this massive life change and feeling very vulnerable and, worry about the dollars and cents as well as trying to figure out how to keep a newborn alive. So thanks so much for sharing some pearls of wisdom with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for listening to The Prosperity Project. You can follow this podcast on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts, and please do chuck us a rating or a review while you're there. For more personal finance and business content, head to nzherald.co.nz, and please do feel free to get in touch with your questions and your stories. nadine.higgins at nzme.co.nz. A reminder, though, that this podcast is informational only and nothing we say here should be considered personalised financial advice. But also remember that while listening to this podcast is hopefully going to be additive to your financial knowledge, and that is fantastic, knowing stuff doesn't create change. Doing stuff does. So what action are you going to take today to make your life more prosperous? My producer for this episode is Ethan Sills. Sound engineer is Richard Martin. I'm Nadine Higgins. Thanks for listening to The Prosperity Project.